The year is 1066, which, inconveniently for the people living in England at the time, is one of those years historians keep talking about forever. If you were an ordinary person back then, you would not have known this. You would have been busy being cold, hungry, and quietly concerned about whose land you were standing on today. England, before William arrived, was already tired. The land had seen Viking raids, political arguments, and kings who did not live very long. People were used to uncertainty. What they were not used to was a complete administrative reset delivered by a man from Normandy who owned a very determined haircut and an army that did not feel like leaving. William did not originally wake up one morning thinking, "I should become King of England." He mostly thought England already belonged to him. This belief came from a complicated chain of promises, family connections, and misunderstandings that were extremely convincing if you were Norman, and much less convincing if you were English. When King Edward died without a clear heir, England tried to solve the problem internally. It chose Harold, a powerful noble who already lived there and understood the weather. This seemed reasonable. Unfortunately, William disagreed. He felt that England had been promised to him earlier, possibly with gestures, vague words, or strong eye contact. Medieval politics was flexible like that. So, William gathered ships, soldiers, horses, and enough confidence to cross the channel. This crossing itself took time, a lot of time. Medieval invasions did not happen quickly. They involved waiting for the right wind, staring at the sea, and arguing about supplies. Meanwhile, England waited too, although not very calmly. When the two sides finally met at Hastings, the result was violent, loud, and deeply inconvenient for everyone involved. Harold died, William did not. This single outcome changed England for centuries, though at the time it mostly changed who was in charge of the castles and who was no longer allowed to keep their land. After the conquest, William did not relax. He did not tour the countryside shaking hands. He began reorganizing England with impressive thoroughness. Land was redistributed to Norman nobles. English lords were quietly removed, sometimes politely, sometimes not. The language of power changed. French words began appearing in courts, laws, and kitchens, while English survived mostly among people who worked outside. Castles began to rise across the landscape. Not the romantic stone ruins you imagine today, but wooden structures placed very deliberately to remind everyone who was watching. They were symbols of control, administration, and the uncomfortable feeling that someone was always nearby. For ordinary people, daily life became heavier rather than dramatically different. You still farmed, you still paid taxes, you just paid them to someone new, in a language you might not understand. The Norman system was orderly, methodical, and extremely fond of records. This culminated in a massive survey of land and resources, counting people, animals, and fields with impressive seriousness. This survey did not exist to help anyone sleep better. It existed to make sure nothing escaped notice. If you owned land, worked land, or even stood on land for too long, it was probably written down somewhere. England became one of the most closely documented places in medieval Europe, whether it liked it or not. Religion changed more quietly. Churches remained, but leadership shifted. Norman clergy replaced English ones. Architecture changed too, slowly introducing heavier stone buildings that looked permanent, serious, and slightly intimidating. Everything felt more structured, more controlled, and less forgiving. William ruled with caution and force at the same time. Rebellions happened. They were dealt with, sometimes gently, sometimes in ways that left regions empty and silent for years. Over time, resistance faded into routine. Norman rule became normal. England adjusted, because it had to. By the end of William's life, England was no longer purely English in the old sense. It had become something layered. Language, law, land, and power were permanently altered. The transformation was not dramatic every day. Most days, it was slow, administrative, and exhausting. And this, in many ways, is how England became the England we recognize now. Not through a single battle alone, but through decades of quiet change, paperwork, and people adapting because history gave them no other option. We will continue, slowly, in the next part. After William secured the crown, he faced a problem that often appears after invasions, which is that the conquered population does not immediately become cooperative just because you say so. England, inconveniently, continued to exist. People kept their habits, their language, and their quiet resentment. William understood this and responded with a mixture of patience, surveillance, and castles placed where they would be most irritating. One of William's first priorities was ownership. Not abstract ownership, but very specific ownership. Who owned which field? Who owed how much service? Who answered to whom? The Norman solution to uncertainty was documentation. England, which had functioned largely on local custom, was now being measured, categorized, and filed away. Land that had belonged to English nobles was reassigned to Norman followers. This was not done randomly. William was careful. No single noble received too much power in one place. Estates were scattered across regions, ensuring loyalty remained upward rather than local. This made England feel less like a homeland and more like a carefully managed project. For ordinary villagers, the change felt subtle but constant. The person demanding taxes spoke differently. Legal disputes were handled in unfamiliar terms. Authority now wore different clothes and lived behind walls. The village itself stayed where it was. The rules hovering above it did not. Language shifted slowly, which is how language prefers to move. French became the language of courts, law, and prestige. English became the language of farming, labor, and complaints made quietly at home. Over time, the two blended. Words for animals stayed English. Words for meat became French. This was not a cultural plan. It was a side effect of who ate what. William ruled England, but did not trust it. He spent large amounts of time back in Normandy, which meant England was governed by deputies, sheriffs, and administrators, who were extremely loyal and extremely thorough. The sheriff system expanded. These officials collected taxes, enforced laws, and reminded everyone that the king's authority was not optional. Rebellions occurred, especially in the north. The response was severe. Entire regions were devastated to remove resistance. Fields were burned, villages emptied. This period, later remembered as the harrying of the North, left scars that lasted generations. It was not dramatic on a daily basis. It was methodical, cold, and effective. Religion was reshaped without changing its surface. Churches remained. Faith continued. But leadership changed. English bishops were replaced with Norman ones. Cathedrals were rebuilt, larger, heavier, and more permanent. Stone replaced wood. These buildings were statements. They said the new order was not temporary. The most famous administrative achievement of William's reign came later, and it was deeply unexciting. It involved lists. In 1086, the king ordered a survey of his entire kingdom. Land, livestock, households, and obligations were recorded with unsettling precision. This became known as the Domesday Book, not because it was religious, but because there was no appeal from it. If your land was listed, it was taxed. If your livestock was counted, it was owed. If you existed in England, you were probably included. The survey was so complete that historians still rely on it today, which suggests it did its job extremely well, and to the mild annoyance of everyone involved. William aged while ruling. He became heavier, slower, and more cautious. Power remained centralized, but cracks appeared. His sons argued. Succession became complicated. The kingdom William had built was stable, but stability requires maintenance, and maintenance requires people who agree on things. When William died in 1087, he left behind a transformed England. The Norman conquest was no longer new. It had settled into routine. The people living under it were used to it. They had learned the rules. They had adapted. England did not collapse. It absorbed. It blended. It changed quietly, over generations. The conquest ended, but its consequences did not. They stretched forward into law, language, and identity, long after the man himself was buried. And so the transformation continued, not loudly, not quickly, but persistently. History, as usual, moved forward one administrative decision at a time. After William's death, England did not pause to reflect. It rarely does. The machinery he put in place continued moving forward, powered by habit, fear, and paperwork. The Norman transformation did not end with one man. It simply became less personal and more routine, which is often how lasting change prefers to operate. William's sons inherited not just land, but expectations. England was now a kingdom where authority flowed downward through carefully layered systems. Kings ruled, nobles administered, Sheriffs enforced, and peasants complied. This structure did not require inspiration. It required consistency, and consistency, in medieval governance, usually meant collecting taxes on time. For most people, daily life remained physically demanding and emotionally restrained. You woke early. You worked the land. You hoped the weather behaved. The Norman presence hovered above this routine, rather than interrupting it directly. Power was distant, but unmistakable. You might never see a Norman lord, but you would feel him in rents, obligations, and rules that did not bend easily. Villages remained the center of life. They were small, familiar, and slow to change. Norman influence crept in gradually. New legal terms appeared. New expectations formed. Written records mattered more than memory. Agreements were documented rather than remembered. This shift alone altered how people understood fairness. If something was not written down, it increasingly did not count. Law became heavier. The Normans favored clear hierarchies and defined penalties. Justice was no longer just a local matter resolved by neighbors. It was part of a larger system that reported upward. Fines replaced apologies. Authority replaced consensus. This did not make life fairer. It made it more predictable, which rulers tend to prefer. Castles continued spreading across England, not because rebellion was constant, but because reminder was useful. Their presence was psychological as much as military. You did not need to be attacked to feel watched. Stone walls do that quietly on their own. The countryside changed too. Forests were designated as royal property. Hunting became restricted. Animals that had once been food became symbols of authority. Breaking forest law could be punished severely. This was less about wildlife and more about control. Even nature, it turned out, could be regulated. Language continued its slow transformation. English survived stubbornly. It absorbed French words without asking permission. Over generations, this created a hybrid tongue that reflected the social divide. The words of power and refinement came from Norman French. The words of labor and survival stayed Germanic. English became a record of inequality you could hear. Religion remained a stabilizing force, which was precisely why the Normans reshaped its leadership so carefully. Churches taught obedience. Clergy reinforced order. Grand cathedrals rose slowly, stone by stone, reinforcing the idea that the new system was permanent. You do not build that large if you plan to leave soon. Trade expanded quietly. Markets grew. Towns developed more structure. Norman rule encouraged consistency in coinage and measurement. This made commerce slightly less chaotic, which benefited those who already had something to trade. For everyone else, it simply added another layer of obligation. Women's lives changed less dramatically than noble titles. Work remained work. Family remained central. Property laws shifted slowly, often favoring male inheritance more strongly than before. Stability, again, came at a cost. Predictability favored systems, not individuals. Education remained limited, but literacy among clergy and administrators increased. Writing mattered. Records mattered. England became a place where memory alone was no longer enough. This altered how history itself would be preserved. We know more about Norman England precisely because it insisted on being written down. Over time, resistance faded not because it vanished, but because it became impractical. The Norman system rewarded compliance and punished disruption. Most people adjusted. They learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to accept change without comment. By the early 12th century, the conquest no longer felt new. Children were born into it. They did not remember a different England. This is how transformation truly completes itself. Not through force alone, but through normality. The Norman imprint settled into the land, into habits, into words. England had changed, not overnight, but permanently. And for the people living through it, this did not feel historic. It felt ordinary. We continue, gently, in the next part. By the time the Norman system settled into its rhythm, it stopped feeling like an occupation and started feeling like administration. This was not exciting. It was not inspiring. It was simply there, every day, quietly shaping how England functioned. Most people did not wake up thinking about Normans. They woke up thinking about work, weather, and whether anyone had moved the boundary markers again. The countryside was still the heart of England. Farming dictated the calendar. Seasons mattered more than kings, yet the invisible presence of Norman authority hovered above the fields. Obligations were clearer now. Rents were defined, services were expected. The vagueness of earlier arrangements slowly disappeared, replaced by systems that did not rely on memory or goodwill. Manors became the basic unit of life. Each manor was a small, self-contained world, overseen by a lord who might never visit. Management fell to stewards, bailiffs, and local officials whose main skill was making sure nothing went unpaid. Life within the manor was repetitive. This repetition was not accidental. It made people predictable. Peasants worked long hours for modest returns. They owed labor, produce, and loyalty. In exchange, they received protection, land to farm, and the privilege of remaining where they were. Mobility was limited. Leaving without permission was difficult. England was becoming organized, but not flexible. Food remained simple. Bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasional meat filled most diets. Norman influence introduced new tastes at the top of society, but these did not trickle down quickly. Feasts happened elsewhere. Hunger remained democratic. Clothing was practical. Wool dominated. Colors depended on access and wealth. Most people wore variations of the same garments for years. Fashion moved slowly, if at all. Stability, again, was the theme. Law continued tightening its grip. Courts operated more formally. Fines replaced personal negotiation. Disputes were recorded. This did not necessarily reduce conflict, but it changed how conflict was resolved. Justice became something delivered, not discussed. Punishments were public. They were meant to be seen. Shame and visibility replaced reconciliation. Authority preferred clear outcomes over messy compromises. This reinforced hierarchy in ways that required no explanation. The church played a quiet but constant role. It marked time, life events, and moral boundaries. Bells regulated the day. Sermons reinforced obedience. Norman clergy ensured alignment between spiritual duty and political order. This cooperation was subtle and effective. Education remained largely clerical. Reading and writing were tools of administration, not self-expression. Literacy meant power. Those who could write controlled memory itself. England's past was increasingly shaped by those who documented it. Towns grew slowly. Trade expanded. Markets became more regular. Norman rule encouraged standardized measures and coinage. This made transactions easier to manage and harder to escape. Commerce flourished cautiously. Crafts developed within guild-like structures. Skills passed from parent to child. Innovation happened quietly, without recognition. Survival was the priority, not improvement. Social mobility was rare. Birth determined most outcomes. A few exceptions existed, usually tied to service or church involvement. These stories were remembered precisely because they were unusual. The environment itself was reorganized. Forest laws restricted access to land and resources. Hunting rights symbolized control. Violations were punished harshly. Nature was no longer neutral. It belonged to someone. This period was not filled with dramatic events. It was filled with continuity. Days blurred together. Years passed without comment. This is why it worked. The Norman transformation embedded itself not through constant force, but through routine. Children grew up knowing nothing else. They learned rules without questioning their origin. They spoke a blended language. They accepted boundaries as normal. History, in this phase, became invisible. The conquest had ended long ago. What remained was a system that sustained itself quietly. England was no longer resisting. It was functioning. And when history functions smoothly, it rarely announces itself. It simply continues. We will drift onward in the next part. As the Norman system aged, it developed something every long-lasting system eventually acquires: boredom. Not the kind that inspires rebellion, but the kind that settles in and convinces people that this is simply how things are. England, by now, was running on habit. Habit is powerful. It requires very little supervision. Most villagers lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and unnecessary, unless forced by duty or disaster. The wider kingdom existed mostly as rumor. The king was a distant figure, discussed occasionally, blamed often, and rarely seen. Authority functioned perfectly well without proximity. The manor court became an important local institution. It handled minor disputes, enforced obligations, and reminded everyone of their place. These courts were not designed to be fair. They were designed to be final. Decisions were recorded. Memory was no longer flexible. Once written, an outcome hardened. Labor obligations structured the week. Certain days belonged to the Lord, other days belonged to survival. This rhythm shaped expectations. Time itself became partially owned. You did not simply work when you wished. You worked when required, and then again for yourself, hoping there was enough energy left. Family life remained central, but constrained. Marriage was practical. Children were economic contributors early. Affection existed, but necessity guided decisions. Loss was common. Life expectancy was low. Grief was frequent and private. There was little time to dwell. Health was unpredictable. Illness moved quickly through villages. Treatment relied on tradition, prayer, and patience. The Norman administration did not concern itself with medicine for the poor. Survival was considered a local responsibility. The church offered structure when nothing else did. It marked beginnings and endings. It explained suffering. It promised meaning. Under Norman leadership, it also reinforced hierarchy. Obedience was not just practical, it was virtuous. Meanwhile, the ruling class lived differently, but not necessarily comfortably. Noble obligations were heavy. Loyalty had to be demonstrated constantly. Land grants came with expectations of military service and administration. Power required effort. Failure had consequences. Castles evolved from wooden structures into stone fortifications. This took time, resources, and labor, much of it unpaid. These buildings dominated landscapes and imaginations. They were not just defenses, they were statements of permanence. Records multiplied. Charters, rolls, surveys, and legal documents accumulated quietly. England's memory expanded on parchment. This made the kingdom legible to rulers and increasingly opaque to those without access. Trade routes became more predictable. Towns gained privileges through charters. Urban life slowly separated from rural life. This created new identities, new tensions, and new hierarchies. Change, as always, moved unevenly. Language continued blending. Children grew up bilingual in practice, even if not consciously. They understood French authority, terms, and English daily speech. This hybrid became natural. No one asked permission for it to happen. Conflict did not disappear. It simply became regulated. Violence required justification. Disputes moved into courts. Rebellion became rare because it was impractical, not because it was unthinkable. By this stage, the Norman conquest was no longer a story people told. It was background noise. It explained things without being discussed. Systems functioned. Roles were known. Expectations were fixed. History, at this point, was quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from acceptance rather than contentment. England moved forward not because it chose to, but because time does that on its own. We continue, slowly, in the next part. As decades passed, the Norman transformation became less about conquest and more about maintenance. Systems do not survive on momentum alone. They require attention, correction, and the occasional reminder of who benefits from them. England, now firmly organized, entered a phase where change happened in margins rather than headlines. Kings came and went, each inheriting a structure they were expected to preserve. Innovation was risky. Stability was safer. The crown focused on enforcing existing rights rather than inventing new ones. Authority preferred familiarity. Familiarity reduced friction. The relationship between lord and tenant hardened into expectation. Obligations were no longer negotiable. They were assumed. This made planning easier for rulers and heavier for everyone else. Predictability replaced flexibility. This was considered progress. Agriculture improved slowly. Tools changed modestly. Crop rotation became more common. These improvements increased output but also expectations. More productivity meant higher rents. Efficiency rarely benefited those producing it. Village life revolved around repetition. The same paths were walked. The same fields were worked. The same disputes resurfaced. Change, when it arrived, felt intrusive. Tradition offered comfort even when it offered little else. Festivals punctuated the year. Religious holidays provided brief relief from labor. These moments mattered. They broke the rhythm. They reminded people that time was not entirely owned by obligation. Joy was temporary but necessary. Justice continued its formalization. Written law expanded. Precedent mattered more. Local customs faded in importance when they conflicted with centralized authority. This reduced ambiguity, which rulers disliked, and reduced autonomy, which villagers missed. Punishments remained visible. Order relied on example. The threat of consequence was more effective than constant enforcement. Fear worked quietly. The church's influence deepened. Parish life structured community. Confession regulated behavior. Moral instruction reinforced obedience. This alignment between spiritual and secular authority strengthened both. Nobility remained divided. Loyalty was expected but not guaranteed. Rivalries persisted. Land disputes occurred. Power required constant negotiation within the elite. Stability at the bottom did not imply harmony at the top. Castles aged alongside the system. Stone weathered. Walls were repaired. Garrisons rotated. These structures became landmarks rather than novelties. Their presence was normalized. Records continued accumulating. England's bureaucracy thickened. Administration became a profession. Clerks mattered. Literacy became a gatekeeper. Those who could read controlled access to power indirectly. Trade networks widened. Coinage circulated more reliably. Markets connected regions. This brought opportunity and regulation. Prosperity came with oversight. Women's roles remained constrained but essential. Household management required skill. Informal authority existed within domestic spaces. These contributions were rarely recorded, but they sustained daily life. Children inherited position more than possibility. Education remained limited. Expectations were inherited alongside land or labor. Social mobility remained rare and remarkable. The landscape itself reflected control. Boundaries were marked. Paths were regulated. Resources were allocated. England was mapped not just geographically, but administratively. By now, no one spoke of conquest. The Normans were no longer outsiders. They were simply the ruling class. Identity blurred. Origin mattered less than position. This is how transformation completes itself. Not with drama, but with normalization. When people stop noticing change, it has usually succeeded. England continued. Quietly. Predictably. Under rules no one remembered choosing. And so the story moves forward, without hurry, into the next part. As the Norman system matured, it began to produce something less visible but deeply influential: expectation. People no longer asked why things were done a certain way. They simply assumed they must be done that way. This is the stage where systems stop defending themselves and start sustaining themselves. Village boundaries were known by instinct. Everyone understood which field belonged to whom, which paths were permitted, and which mistakes were better left unspoken. Disputes still happened, but they followed predictable routes. Complaint led to court led to fine led to quiet resentment. Life continued. The passing of time mattered more than events. Years were measured in harvests, not rains. Weather shaped memory more than politics. A good summer was remembered longer than a distant coronation. The Norman order existed in the background, steady and unmoving, like a wall you learned not to lean against. Taxes remained a constant presence. They arrived regularly, demanded calmly, and were rarely negotiable. Payment was not framed as punishment. It was framed as obligation. This framing mattered. It reduced resistance. It turned compliance into routine. Military service was expected when called upon, though many villagers never saw battle. They contributed indirectly, through labor and supply. War, like everything else, was managed through systems. The violence was distant. The cost was local. Towns continued to grow slowly. Markets became meeting points not just for trade, but for information. News traveled with merchants. Most of it was irrelevant. Occasionally, it mattered. Usually, it did not change anything. Guild-like organizations formed informally. Skills were protected. Knowledge was shared carefully. Entry was controlled. These structures offered stability within limitation. They allowed survival, not advancement. Marriage patterns remained practical. Alliances mattered more than affection. Dowries were negotiated. Property transferred quietly. Love existed, but it was not a requirement. The system did not depend on it. The church calendar structured the year. Saints' days interrupted labor. Ritual offered relief from repetition. Faith did not remove hardship, but it provided explanation. Explanation was valuable. Written records continued to dominate authority. If something was documented, it existed. If it was not, it could be denied. This shifted power away from memory and toward those who could control ink and parchment. The ruling class adapted as well. Norman nobles became English landholders in practice, if not in name. Their children were born locally, accents softened, identity blurred. The divide remained, but it was less sharp. Violence became more regulated. Feuds were discouraged. Private justice was replaced by public procedure. This did not eliminate cruelty. It centralized it. Peasant resistance survived in small ways. Delays, silence, selective obedience. These acts were rarely dramatic. They were survival strategies. Time continued passing. Generations replaced one another. The memory of conquest faded into stories told without urgency. Children grew up knowing only this order. To them, it was not imposed. It was normal. And when something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. England moved forward not because it was pushed, but because the system allowed no other direction. We drift onward, quietly, into the next part. By now, the Norman transformation had reached a stage historians later describe with enthusiasm, and everyone living through it experienced as routine. The structures worked, which meant they were rarely questioned. England had become a place where order mattered more than origin, at least on the surface. Administration continued expanding in small, careful steps. More officials existed than before. More roles were defined. Authority flowed through channels that rarely overlapped. This reduced confusion, which was helpful, and reduced flexibility, which was not discussed. The Crown relied heavily on trusted intermediaries. Sheriffs, clerks, and local officers acted as the eyes and hands of distant power. Most of them were not cruel. They were precise. Precision can feel colder than cruelty because it does not pause for explanation. Money became more important. Coinage circulated more reliably. Rents increasingly shifted from labor to payment. This change was subtle but significant. Time could now be exchanged for money, which could then be demanded regularly. Obligation became numerical. Markets benefited from this shift. Trade expanded. Towns gained confidence. Urban life offered slightly more freedom, provided you accepted regulation. Charters granted privileges in exchange for loyalty. Independence came with conditions. Rural life remained steady. Farming dominated. Tools improved incrementally. Output rose slowly. Expectations rose faster. The gap between effort and reward did not narrow. Homes remained simple. Fires smoked. Floors were hard. Comfort was limited. People adapted. Comfort was not assumed. Survival was. Health remained uncertain. Disease moved unpredictably. Community responses relied on isolation, prayer, and resignation. The administrative system noted losses without addressing causes. The church continued reinforcing structure. Parish priests mediated daily concerns. Larger institutions managed land, wealth, and influence. Faith provided continuity. Authority benefited from it. Education remained concentrated. Literacy was still a tool of governance. Knowledge passed downward selectively. Curiosity existed but lacked support. The legal system grew heavier. More cases were recorded. Precedent mattered. This created consistency, which benefited authority and frustrated those accustomed to negotiation. Violence decreased in visibility but not in impact. Punishment became procedural. Order was maintained quietly. Fear was embedded rather than displayed. Identity continued blending. Norman names sounded English. English speech absorbed French terms. Class distinction remained audible. Language became a marker of position rather than origin. Resistance existed in quiet forms. Delay. Non-compliance disguised as misunderstanding. These acts rarely changed outcomes. They preserved dignity. Time passed. The conquest receded further into the past. It no longer explained current rules. Rules existed because they existed. This is the moment when transformation becomes inheritance. Systems are passed down without memory of creation. Authority persists without justification. England, by this stage, was no longer adjusting. It was operating. And when something operates smoothly enough, it begins to feel inevitable. We continue, slowly, into the next part. At this point in the story, nothing dramatic happens, which is precisely the point. The Norman transformation had reached a level of quiet efficiency that made history feel almost boring to the people living inside it. Boring, in governance, is a sign of success. England functioned. That was the achievement. The kingdom now ran on expectation rather than enforcement. Most rules did not need to be explained. People knew what was required because it had always been required. When something goes wrong often enough, it eventually becomes a routine to prevent it. Norman England was full of these routines. The countryside continued its slow rhythm. Fields were worked, crops were harvested, livestock wandered where they were allowed and nowhere else. Boundaries mattered more than before. Crossing them without permission was not adventurous. It was inconvenient. Local officials carried much of the system's weight. Bailiffs, reeves, and clerks enforced obligations quietly. Their power was limited but constant. They did not rule. They reminded. Reminders were usually enough. Taxes arrived on schedule. This reliability shaped behavior. People planned around it. They did not like it, but dislike had very little effect. Compliance was easier than resistance, and everyone understood this without discussion. Land ownership was now deeply formalized. Titles mattered. Charters mattered. Disputes were settled by documents rather than memory. This favored those who could navigate the system and confused those who could not. Confusion rarely altered outcomes. Rural communities remained close-knit, not out of affection, but necessity. Survival required cooperation. The system allowed limited local autonomy as long as obligations were met. This balance kept things running smoothly. Towns developed clearer identities. Crafts specialized. Trade routes stabilized. Urban life offered modest opportunity and strict regulation. Freedom existed within defined limits. People accepted this trade without enthusiasm. Social hierarchy remained rigid. Birth continued, determining most futures. Rare exceptions were noticed and discussed precisely because they were rare. The system did not rely on hope. It relied on predictability. The church continued anchoring time and morality. Bells structured days. Rituals structured years. Sermons reinforced order gently but persistently. Faith and authority remained aligned. Education remained restricted. Literacy slowly expanded among administrators and merchants. Knowledge was practical, not philosophical. Reading existed to serve function, not curiosity. Legal culture grew increasingly procedural. Justice followed steps. Steps were recorded. Appeals were limited. Outcomes were final. This reduced uncertainty and increased resignation. Violence existed mostly at the margins. Punishment was still present, but rarely chaotic. Authority preferred control to spectacle. Fear was institutional rather than personal. Language continued its quiet evolution. English absorbed Norman influence until the distinction blurred. The language people spoke reflected the society they lived in, layered, unequal, and practical. Memory of conquest faded further. It was now something scholars discussed rather than people experienced. The system felt ancient even though it was relatively new. Longevity creates the illusion of permanence. Children born into this world accepted it without question. They learned boundaries early. They learned expectations. They learned silence where appropriate. This was not taught formally. It was absorbed. The Norman transformation had completed its most important task. It had removed the sense of alternatives. When people stop imagining different structures, structures become stable. England continued under this quiet weight of order, not prosperous for all, not gentle for most, but consistent. History did not announce itself. It simply continued, day after day, under rules no one remembered choosing. And this is where long stories begin to slow even further. We will continue, calmly, into the next part. As the Norman system carried on, it developed something even more powerful than authority: inertia. By now, England did not need constant direction. It moved forward on its own weight. The rules were embedded deeply enough that people followed them without thinking, the way one avoids stepping into a cold stream unless absolutely necessary. Daily life remained physically demanding and emotionally contained. Most people did not expect improvement. They expected continuity. Expectations were modest, which helped prevent disappointment. If nothing worsened, that was considered success. Agricultural routines dominated everything. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, repairing tools, and enduring weather filled the year. The system depended on this predictability. Food production mattered more than innovation. Stability mattered more than comfort. Land remained the central measure of value. Who controlled it, who worked it, and who benefited from it were all clearly defined. These definitions were enforced quietly. You did not argue with them unless you wanted attention. and attention was rarely helpful. Local governance continued operating through familiar faces. The same officials, the same procedures, the same expectations. Power felt personal at this level, even though it was part of something larger. This made obedience easier. You complied with people you knew. Taxes and rents remained the most reliable interruptions to ordinary life. Their regularity shaped planning. Families calculated survival around obligations first and needs second. The system ensured it was paid before anyone else was. Homes changed little. Improvements were slow and practical. Repairs mattered more than expansion. Comfort was secondary. Fire, shelter, and food were the priorities. Everything else was optional. Illness continued to arrive without warning. Medical knowledge remained limited. Recovery was uncertain. Death was familiar. Communities absorbed loss quietly. There was no system designed to help beyond prayer and support from neighbors. Religion remained woven into daily life. Faith explained hardship. Ritual provided structure. The church reinforced patience and obedience without raising its voice. Authority benefited from this partnership without having to acknowledge it openly. Education remained narrow. Literacy was still uncommon outside administrative circles. Knowledge flowed downward carefully. Curiosity existed, but it had nowhere to go. Survival left little time for questions. Trade continued expanding at a measured pace. Markets became more predictable. Weights and measures standardized further. This reduced chaos and increased oversight. Opportunity arrived accompanied by regulation. Social mobility remained rare. Most people lived and died within the same social category. This predictability reduced ambition. It also reduced conflict. The system did not depend on dreams. It depended on acceptance. The ruling class managed power cautiously. Alliances shifted. Disputes occurred. Authority required maintenance even at the top. Stability below did not eliminate competition above. Power always attracts attention. Castles aged into landmarks. They no longer shocked. They were simply part of the landscape. Their presence no longer threatened. It reassured. It reminded people that the system was permanent. Records continued growing. England's memory expanded further into parchment and ink. Administration documented everything it could. What could be recorded could be controlled. What could not was ignored. Language continued evolving without guidance. The blend of Norman and English speech settled into something familiar. Class distinctions remained audible, but origin mattered less than position. Identity became quieter. Resistance survived only in minor forms. Delay. Compliance without enthusiasm. These gestures preserved dignity without altering outcomes. The system tolerated them because they did not threaten it. Time passed. Generations replaced one another. The conquest receded even further into abstraction. It was now history rather than experience. The system felt ancient, even though it was not. This is the moment when power becomes background noise. It is always present, rarely noticed, and almost never questioned. England did not celebrate its transformation. It lived inside it. Nothing dramatic happened. And because of that, everything stayed the same. We will continue, unhurried, in the next part. By the early 12th century, the Norman transformation had become so thoroughly embedded that it no longer felt like a transformation at all. It felt like background. And background, by definition, does not ask for attention. It simply exists, doing its work quietly while people focus on surviving their own small lives. England now operated through layers that rarely touched directly. The king remained distant. Nobles managed land. Officials enforced rules. Villagers complied. Each layer understood only enough of the one above to function. This limited understanding was not a flaw, it was a feature. It reduced questions. Daily routines remained narrow and demanding. Work began early. Rest was brief. The rhythm of labor shaped bodies and expectations. People did not plan far ahead. Planning required surplus, and surplus was rare. The future was something you arrived at, rather than prepared for. Authority remained predictable. Predictability mattered more than kindness. People learned when taxes were due, when labor was owed, and when silence was safer than complaint. This knowledge passed from parent to child without instruction. Children absorbed it by watching adults avoid trouble. Village life continued under informal rules, layered beneath formal ones. Neighbors relied on one another. Cooperation was necessary. Conflict was managed carefully. Disputes rarely escalated beyond what could be handled locally, because escalation attracted attention. Attention brought officials. Officials brought consequences. The legal system continued refining itself. Procedures expanded, records multiplied, written law gained weight over spoken agreement. This benefited those who could navigate it and excluded those who could not. Over time, exclusion became normal. Religion remained steady. Churches anchored communities physically and emotionally. Sermons reinforced patience. Rituals softened hardship without removing it. Faith explained inequality as part of a larger design. This explanation was not comforting, but it was familiar. Trade continued its gradual growth. Towns gained modest independence through charters. Markets became reliable. Urban life offered slightly more freedom. At the cost of regulation, freedom was conditional. It always was. Crafts became more specialized. Skills passed down quietly. Innovation occurred when necessary, not for ambition. Survival remained the goal. Improvement was accidental. Women's lives remained constrained by expectation, but essential to continuity. Household management required coordination, memory, and endurance. These contributions were rarely documented. The system depended on them regardless. Health remained uncertain. Disease continued appearing without warning. Communities responded as they always had, with isolation, prayer, and resignation. Administration noted population changes without addressing causes. Loss was recorded but not prevented. Education remained limited to those who served the system. Clergy, clerks, and merchants gained literacy. Writing remained a tool of control rather than exploration. Knowledge flowed downward, slowly and selectively. The ruling elite continued managing internal tensions. Alliances shifted. Land disputes persisted. Power required constant negotiation even among those who held it. Stability below masked competition above. Castles no longer symbolized conquest. They symbolized continuity. Their presence reassured authority and discouraged curiosity. You did not wonder why they existed. You accepted that they did. Language settled further into its blended form. English absorbed Norman influence until the distinction became difficult to separate. Class differences remained audible. Power could still be heard in speech patterns. Resistance remained quiet. People resisted by delaying, misunderstanding, or complying without enthusiasm. These acts did not threaten the system. They allowed individuals to preserve some sense of agency without consequence. Memory of conquest continued fading. It existed in chronicles, not conversations. Ordinary people did not explain their lives through history. They explained them through work, weather, and obligation. Children born into this world inherited structure without origin. Rules existed because they existed. Authority was accepted because it always had been. This is how systems become durable, not through force alone, but through familiarity. England continued operating under this quiet weight of order, not fair, not gentle, but steady. And steadiness, in history, often lasts longer than justice. We will continue, slowly, into the next part. As time continued doing what it always does, the Norman system entered a phase best described as comfortable for those in charge and unavoidable for everyone else. England was no longer being shaped. It had been shaped. Now it was simply being used. Power no longer needed to explain itself. It operated through habit, repetition, and quiet enforcement. When authority becomes routine, it rarely feels oppressive in obvious ways. It feels heavy in small, constant ways, like carrying something you forgot you were holding. Village life remained predictable. The same fields, the same paths, the same obligations. Predictability provided a strange sense of security. Change was more frightening than hardship. People knew how to endure what they recognized. Seasonal rhythms continued dominating existence. Weather decided success or failure more often than rulers did. A good harvest mattered more than a stable succession. Hunger ignored politics entirely. Local officials remained the most visible face of authority. They were neither heroes nor villains. They were functionaries. They enforced rules because enforcement was their role. Compassion was optional. Compliance was not. Taxes remained steady. Rents remained fixed. Obligations were measured and repeated. The system favored consistency over fairness. Fairness required judgment. Consistency required lists. Homes showed little improvement. Repairs mattered more than comfort. Expansion was rare. Space remained limited. privacy was minimal. Life was shared because it had to be. Health continued its unpredictability. Injury and illness disrupted lives without warning. Recovery depended on luck more than skill. Death was present but unremarkable. Communities adapted by continuing. Religion continued offering structure rather than relief. Faith did not promise comfort. It promised meaning. Meaning helped people endure things they could not change. Education remained narrow. Knowledge stayed concentrated among those serving administration or the church. Reading and writing were still instruments, not freedoms. Literacy meant access. Access meant power. Trade continued its slow expansion. Towns grew cautiously. Regulation followed growth closely. Opportunity existed, but only within limits. Limits were enforced quietly. Social hierarchy remained intact. Birth determined outcome. Exceptions existed, but they were notable precisely because they disrupted expectation. The system absorbed them without altering itself. The ruling class continued managing authority carefully. Power required vigilance. Loyalty shifted. Stability below did not remove uncertainty above. Governance was never effortless. Castles stood unchanged. Their walls aged. Their presence remained. They no longer intimidated consciously. They reassured subconsciously. Authority prefers permanence. Records continued accumulating. England's identity increasingly existed in documentation. Land, people, obligations, all written down. If something was recorded, it was real. If not, it faded. Language continued evolving naturally. The blend of Norman and English speech felt ordinary now. No one noticed it changing. Change is easiest to accept when it is unnoticed. Resistance remained quiet and personal. Small delays, quiet refusals disguised as confusion. These actions preserved dignity without consequence. The system tolerated them because they did not threaten order. The conquest was now distant, even in memory. It existed as background knowledge, not lived experience. People did not explain their lives through it. They explained them through routine. This is the stage where history becomes quietest, when nothing feels new, when everything feels settled, when systems stop justifying themselves and simply continue. England moved forward without enthusiasm, without resistance, and without pause. We will continue, gently, in the next part. By this stage, the Norman transformation had reached a depth where it no longer produced tension. It produced habit, and habit, once established, is remarkably difficult to dislodge. England was not being ruled loudly. It was being managed quietly, which is far more effective over long periods of time. Most people no longer distinguished between what had existed before and what existed now. The past was not a reference point. It was a vague idea. Daily life provided enough structure that historical comparison felt unnecessary. You did not ask whether things had once been different. You asked whether the harvest would be sufficient. Authority remained layered and distant. The king existed as an idea rather than a presence. His power arrived through documents, officials, and expectations. This made obedience impersonal. You were not obeying a man. You were obeying a system. Systems are harder to argue with. Village routines continued unchanged. Labor filled the day. Rest filled very little of it. People adapted not because they approved, but because adaptation required less energy than resistance. Over time, adaptation became instinct. Local disputes still occurred. Boundaries were crossed. Obligations were questioned. These conflicts followed predictable paths. They were resolved formally or quietly suppressed. Either outcome preserved order. Disorder was inefficient. The legal framework grew heavier without becoming more humane. More rules existed. More procedures applied. This did not eliminate injustice. It standardized it. Predictability mattered more than equity. Religion remained a constant presence. Faith explained hierarchy without challenging it. Obedience was framed as virtue. Patience was praised. Endurance became moral. These lessons were repeated gently and often. Education continued serving authority. Literacy remained limited and functional. Knowledge was not encouraged for curiosity. It was encouraged for service. Understanding your place mattered more than understanding the world. Trade networks expanded gradually. Towns became more structured. Urban life offered slightly different constraints rather than freedom. Regulation replaced tradition. Opportunity existed, but only within clearly defined limits. Social roles remained fixed. Birth determined outcome. Ambition was rarely rewarded. Stability was valued over potential. The system did not need innovation. It needed reliability. The ruling class continued navigating internal tension. Power required negotiation, vigilance, and restraint. Authority was never static. It was maintained through careful balance rather than force alone. Castles stood unchanged. They blended into the landscape. Their presence no longer suggested conquest. It suggested permanence. You do not question walls that have always been there. Records continued accumulating quietly. England's memory grew heavier. Everything that mattered was written down. Everything else faded. History favored documentation over experience. Language continued evolving naturally. Class distinctions remained audible. Speech revealed position more than origin. Identity was practical rather than sentimental. Resistance persisted only in subtle forms. Delay, silence, compliance without enthusiasm. These acts preserved individual dignity without altering outcomes. The system tolerated them. Children grew up knowing no alternative. They learned rules before understanding reasons. This is how authority becomes natural. When explanation is unnecessary, England continued under this quiet structure. Not because it was just, not because it was kind, but because it functioned. And when something functions well enough, it rarely invites change. We continue, slowly, into the next part. By now, the Norman transformation had become something people rarely noticed at all. It was not debated. It was not defended. It simply framed everything. England existed inside it, the way fish exist inside water, aware of movement, but not the medium itself. Daily life continued its narrow, demanding pattern. Work filled most waking hours. Rest was brief and practical. Leisure, when it appeared, was unplanned and modest. The system did not require happiness. It required reliability. Authority felt impersonal. Orders arrived through routine rather than command. Taxes were collected without ceremony. Laws were enforced without explanation. This absence of drama was deliberate. Drama invites questions. Routine discouraged them. Villages remained tightly bound by necessity. Cooperation was not idealistic. It was required. People depended on one another for survival, even when they disliked one another. Conflict existed, but it was managed carefully. Escalation threatened stability, and stability mattered. The legal system continued refining its procedures. Rules multiplied. Outcomes became more predictable. Justice did not become gentler. It became standardized. Predictability replaced mercy as the system's priority. Religion continued offering structure rather than comfort. Faith explained suffering as meaningful. Hierarchy was framed as part of a larger order. Obedience became habit rather than belief. Ritual carried more weight than reflection. Education remained limited and practical. Literacy stayed concentrated among those who served administration or the church. Knowledge existed to maintain systems, not to challenge them. Curiosity survived quietly, without support. Trade continued expanding slowly. Towns grew cautiously. Regulation followed growth closely. Opportunity existed within narrow channels. Success required compliance as much as effort. Social hierarchy remained firm. Birth continued, determining most outcomes. Exceptions existed, but were absorbed without altering the structure. Stability mattered more than potential. The ruling elite continued managing power through negotiation rather than force. Alliances shifted. Disputes occurred. Authority required attention even among those who held it. Stability was maintained through balance, not kindness. Castles stood unchanged. They no longer symbolized fear or conquest. They symbolized continuity. Their presence reassured authority and discouraged imagination. Walls suggest permanence without explanation. Records continued accumulating. England's identity increasingly lived on parchment. Land, people, obligations, all documented. What was written mattered. What was not written disappeared. Language continued evolving quietly. The blend of Norman and English speech felt natural. No one commented on it. Class differences remained audible. Speech revealed position effortlessly. Resistance remained minimal and subtle. Delay, silence, compliance without enthusiasm. These gestures preserved dignity without threatening order. The system tolerated them because they changed nothing. Memory of conquest faded almost entirely. It survived in chronicles, not conversations. People did not explain their lives through history. They explained them through routine. This is the phase where power becomes invisible, when authority feels like nature rather than choice, when rules seem inevitable rather than imposed. England moved forward quietly, under a structure no one remembered choosing. And quiet structures, once settled, tend to last. We will continue, gently, into the next part. As England continued settling into its Norman-shaped routine, something subtle happened. The system stopped needing reinforcement. It no longer relied on reminders of conquest, authority, or threat. It relied on familiarity. Familiarity is efficient. People rarely resist what they recognize as normal. Daily life remained narrow, but dependable. The same patterns repeated themselves with comforting regularity. Fields were worked, animals were tended, repairs were made slowly, using knowledge passed down without ceremony. Improvement was incremental, almost accidental. Survival remained the main objective. Authority was felt more than seen. It existed in schedules, obligations, and expectations that required no explanation. You did not question why certain days belonged to labor or why certain payments were due. They simply were. Questioning consumed energy, better spent enduring. Local officials continued serving as the system's interface. They were known figures, often neighbors, sometimes resented, rarely challenged. Their authority felt personal, even though it represented something distant. This blurred responsibility. People blamed individuals for rules they did not create. Taxes and rents continued shaping planning. Families organized their lives around obligations first. Needs came after. Desire was rarely considered. The system ensured it was satisfied before anyone else was. Homes remained functional. Expansion was rare. Privacy was minimal. Comfort was secondary to durability. People adapted their expectations accordingly. Expecting less made endurance easier. Health remained unpredictable. Injury, illness, and loss occurred without warning. Communities responded as they always had, through support, ritual, and continuation. The system recorded population changes, but did not intervene. Suffering was acknowledged only statistically. Religion continued anchoring time and meaning. Ritual marked transitions. Faith offered explanation without solution. This was often enough. Endurance does not require optimism. It requires acceptance. Education remained narrow and purposeful. Literacy served administration and faith. Knowledge flowed downward cautiously. Curiosity survived quietly, but had little room to grow. Asking questions rarely improved outcomes. Trade continued expanding at a measured pace. Markets connected regions. Regulation followed closely. Opportunity existed but remained bounded. Prosperity came with oversight. Oversight came with obligation. Social roles remained stable. Birth determined trajectory. Exceptions were absorbed without altering structure. The system did not reward ambition. It rewarded compliance and patience. The ruling elite continued maintaining balance among themselves. Power was never effortless. Alliances shifted. Disputes arose. Authority required attention even at the top. Stability below did not remove tension above. Castles aged further into landmarks. They blended into the landscape. Their presence was no longer threatening. It was expected. Permanence no longer required explanation. Records continued accumulating quietly. England's memory grew heavier. What was written mattered. What was not written faded. Administration increasingly defined reality. Language continued evolving naturally. The blend of Norman and English speech felt complete. No one remarked on it. Class distinctions remained audible, but origin mattered less than position. Resistance persisted only in quiet gestures, delay, silence, compliance without enthusiasm. These acts preserved dignity without consequence. The system tolerated them because they did not threaten order. Memory of conquest was now abstract. It existed in documents, not lived experience. People did not explain their lives through it. They explained them through routine and obligation. This is where systems achieve longevity, when they no longer need justification, when they feel as natural as weather. England continued under this quiet structure, not because it was ideal, but because it was familiar. And familiarity, in history, is often stronger than force. We continue, calmly, into the next part. By this point, the Norman transformation had fully ingrained itself into the rhythm of English life. Authority no longer needed to announce itself. It was absorbed into the daily patterns of labor, payment, worship, and survival. People no longer thought about who imposed the rules, they simply followed them. The cycles of farming dictated existence. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, repairing tools, tending livestock. These activities filled the day with mechanical precision. Weather, not rulers, determined success or failure. Predictable hardship became preferable to unpredictable change. Local officials carried on quietly, their presence familiar and largely unremarkable. They enforced duties and recorded obligations. Their authority was subtle but effective. It reminded villagers of hierarchy without confrontation. Compliance was internalized, not coerced. Taxes and rents continued their quiet dominance over scheduling and behavior. Obligations were predictable. Planning revolved around them. Life was organized around the system, more than choice. Survival depended on understanding and following it. Homes remained simple and functional. Comfort was minimal. Repairs mattered more than decoration. Space was shared. Privacy was rare. Adaptation shaped expectations. Acceptance reduced resistance. Health remained unreliable. Illnesses and injuries struck unpredictably. Communities relied on tradition, prayer, and neighborly support. The system recorded numbers but did not intervene. Death remained a constant companion. The church provided structure. Rituals marked the passage of time. Faith explained suffering. Obedience was framed as virtue. Morality and authority were interlinked quietly, reinforcing compliance without overt pressure. Education was practical and limited. Literacy existed mainly for administrative or religious purposes. Knowledge passed downward selectively. Curiosity survived discreetly but lacked avenues for expression. Skill mattered more than theory. Trade expanded gradually. Towns developed slowly under oversight. Markets grew more structured. Opportunity was real but constrained. Prosperity carried obligations. Regulation accompanied every advantage. Social hierarchy remained rigid. Birth determined outcomes. Rare exceptions were noted but did not alter the system. Ambition was tolerated only if it did not disrupt stability. Compliance, endurance, and patience were rewarded, not innovation. Ruling elites maintained careful balance. Alliances shifted. Disputes arose. Authority required constant attention. Stability at the base did not prevent tension at the top. Power was sustained through negotiation and vigilance, rather than force alone. Castles had aged into landmarks. Their presence no longer shocked. They symbolized continuity. They reminded, not threatened. Authority was reinforced by permanence. Records continued to accumulate. England's memory became heavier and more bureaucratic. Land, obligations, and population were meticulously documented. Writing defined reality. What was unwritten ceased to exist in official eyes. Language continued evolving imperceptibly. The blend of Norman and English speech felt entirely natural. Class distinctions remained audible, but origin mattered less than social position. Identity was pragmatic, rather than sentimental. Resistance persisted only in quiet ways. Delay, silence, and muted compliance preserved personal dignity without challenging the system. These small gestures were absorbed without consequence. Memory of conquest faded further. It existed in chronicles and legal documents, not lived experience. People understood their lives through routine, obligation, and survival, not through history. And so the system endured, not because it was just, not because it was kind, but because it had become habitual. England continued quietly, predictably, and inexorably. We will continue, slowly, into the next part. By now, the Norman system had become so routine that it was nearly invisible to those living within it. Authority no longer needed to be enforced with constant attention. It persisted quietly through expectation, habit, and the repetition of obligation. People rarely questioned it because questioning required energy better spent surviving. Life remained structured around labor. Fields demanded attention from dawn until dusk. Livestock required feeding, milking, and protection. Tools needed repair. Weather dictated success more than law or ruler. Continuity mattered more than improvement. Survival depended on following the known pattern rather than seeking innovation. Local officials continued their quiet work. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and clerks collected dues, enforced laws, and recorded events. They were visible, familiar, and predictable. Their authority was understood without confrontation. People complied not because they feared them, but because compliance consumed less effort than resistance. Taxes and rents dictated planning. Obligations arrived on schedule. Families arranged their lives to meet these demands first, with everything else secondary. The system ensured priorities were clear. Life became a series of cycles within cycles. Homes remained simple, functional, and minimally comfortable. Repairs were routine. Expansion was uncommon. Privacy was rare. People adapted expectations accordingly. Predictability was its own reassurance. Health remained unreliable. Illness, injury, and death continued to intrude without warning. Communities responded with practical support, ritual, and endurance. Records acknowledged loss, but intervention remained minimal. Suffering was chronic yet expected. Religion provided continuity. Church rituals structured the year. Faith offered explanation rather than relief. Obedience became habitual. Moral instruction reinforced social order subtly. Compliance was internalized. Education remained limited and purposeful. Literacy existed primarily for administrative and clerical roles. Knowledge was transmitted downward cautiously. Curiosity survived quietly, constrained by necessity. Learning was functional, not exploratory. Trade grew slowly. Markets became structured. Towns expanded cautiously under supervision. Opportunity existed within narrowly defined limits. Prosperity arrived with oversight and obligations. Regulation framed progress. Social hierarchy remained firm. Birth determined outcomes. Rare exceptions were absorbed without changing the system. Stability was prioritized over potential. Ambition was permitted only if it did not disrupt order. The ruling elite maintained internal balance. Alliances shifted. Disputes occurred. Authority required constant attention even at the top. Stability below did not prevent tension above. Governance was sustained through negotiation and vigilance, not force. Castles continued as landmarks. Stone walls blended into the landscape. Their presence reassured rather than intimidated. Permanence communicated authority silently. Records multiplied. England's memory grew heavy with documentation. Land, obligations, people all accounted for. Writing defined reality. The unwritten faded. Administration increasingly determined existence. Language evolved quietly. Norman and English speech blended until distinction became subtle. Social position was audible. Origin mattered less than rank. Identity became practical. Resistance persisted only in quiet gestures. Delay muted compliance, and silence preserved personal dignity without threatening order. The system tolerated these minor deviations because they were ineffective. The conquest itself became distant memory. It existed in chronicles and documents, not lived experience. Daily life was explained through routine, obligation, and adaptation, not history. And so the Norman system endured, less through drama and more through habituation. England continued, predictable, quiet, and steadily ordered. We will continue, softly, into the next part. By this point, the Norman transformation had become entirely integrated into English life. It no longer required reminders of conquest or displays of force. Authority existed as a quiet weight, embedded in daily routines, obligations, and expectations. People rarely thought about the origin of rules, they only knew that following them simplified survival. Daily life continued its narrow, repetitive course. Fields demanded labor, animals required attention, and tools needed constant repair. Weather dictated success more than law or ruler. Predictable hardship replaced uncertainty. Survival was measured by endurance and adaptability, not ambition or improvement. Local officials carried out their duties quietly and consistently. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and clerks enforced obligations, recorded disputes, and maintained records. Their authority was familiar and largely unobtrusive. Compliance became instinctive. Questioning authority consumed more energy than following it, so most did not. Taxes and rents remained regular. Families arranged life around these obligations. Daily schedules, festivals, and work cycles revolved around what was owed. Predictability created a sense of control, even when it was imposed externally. Homes remained practical and simple. Comfort was secondary. Repairs were routine, expansion rare. Privacy was limited. People adapted to the environment, accepting its constraints as natural rather than imposed. Health remained uncertain. Disease, injury, and death arrived without warning. Communities provided support through tradition, ritual, and shared labor. Records noted population changes, but intervention was minimal. Survival relied on endurance more than external aid. Religion continued to anchor time, morality, and community cohesion. Church rituals structured daily life. Faith explained suffering and reinforced social order. Obedience became internalized. Morality and authority intertwined quietly, ensuring stability without explicit enforcement. Education remained limited and utilitarian. Literacy served administrative and clerical functions. Knowledge flowed downward selectively. Curiosity existed but had little outlet. Learning was practical, not exploratory. Understanding one's role mattered more than understanding the world. Trade continued expanding slowly. Towns grew cautiously under oversight. Markets offered opportunity within strict limits. Prosperity arrived alongside obligations and regulation. Success was measured by adherence as much as effort. Social hierarchy remained rigid. Birth determined most futures. Rare exceptions were absorbed without altering the system. Stability was valued above potential. Ambition was permitted only if it did not disrupt order. The ruling elite maintained careful equilibrium. Alliances shifted, disputes arose, and authority required attention even among those at the top. Stability below did not eliminate tension above. Governance persisted through negotiation, vigilance, and routine. Castles blended into the landscape, their presence no longer threatening but expected. Stone walls communicated permanence. They reminded the population of continuity, not conquest. Records multiplied. England's memory grew heavier. Land, obligations, and population were meticulously documented. What was written existed. What was not disappeared from formal acknowledgement. Documentation defined reality. Language continued its quiet evolution. English absorbed Norman influence until the distinction became subtle. Speech revealed social position more than origin. Identity became functional, practical, and largely unquestioned. Resistance existed only in small, discrete forms: delays, silent compliance, or muted protest. These gestures preserved dignity without threatening the system. The administration tolerated them because they were ineffective. Memory of the conquest faded into abstraction. Chronicles and legal documents preserved it for future reference, but ordinary people lived in routine rather than history. Life was understood through obligations, work, and survival, not through dramatic events. And so the Norman order endured, less through spectacle and more through quiet habituation. England continued steadily, predictably, and quietly. We will continue, softly, into the next part. By now, the Norman system had become invisible to most of England. Authority no longer announced itself with force or ceremony. It existed quietly, embedded in schedules, obligations, and social expectations. People rarely questioned the rules because questioning them consumed energy better spent surviving the day. The system had become background, persistent, and unremarkable. Daily life remained narrow and repetitive. Fields required labor, livestock demanded attention, tools needed constant repair, and weather continued to dictate success more than rulers. Predictable hardship became preferable to unpredictable change. Survival depended on endurance, routine, and adaptation. Local officials remained the most tangible link to authority. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and clerks enforced obligations, recorded disputes, and maintained records. Their presence was familiar and mostly unobtrusive. People complied instinctively. Questioning authority was unnecessary and often impractical. Taxes and rents continued to structure life. Families organized around obligations first, needs second. Predictability replaced uncertainty, and the rhythm of payments and labor dominated calendars more than any festival or feast. Homes were practical and functional, not comfortable. Repairs were routine, expansion rare. Privacy was limited. Acceptance of constraints became natural over generations. Life was measured in survival, not comfort. Health remained unreliable. Disease, injury, and death arrived without warning. Communities relied on tradition, ritual, and mutual support. Administration noted population and resources but intervened minimally. Suffering was chronic but expected. Religion anchored both time and morality. Church rituals structured the year. Faith explained hardship and reinforced obedience. Virtue and compliance were internalized. Obedience was habitual, not coerced. Education remained functional and restricted. Literacy existed mainly for administration and clerical work. Knowledge flowed downward selectively. Curiosity survived quietly, rarely influencing outcomes. Understanding one's role mattered more than understanding the world. Trade continued, expanding gradually. Towns grew cautiously. Markets connected regions, while regulation ensured control. Opportunity existed, but always within limits. Prosperity required adherence to obligations. Social hierarchy persisted. Birth largely determined life outcomes. Rare exceptions were absorbed without disrupting the system. Stability was prioritized above potential. Ambition was tolerated only if it did not threaten order. The ruling elite maintained delicate equilibrium. Alliances shifted, disputes arose, and authority required attention even at the top. Stability below did not eliminate tension above. Governance persisted through negotiation, vigilance, and routine rather than overt force. Castles had blended into the landscape. Their presence no longer intimidated but reassured. Stone walls symbolized permanence. Authority was communicated silently, not loudly. Records continued accumulating. England's memory became heavier and more bureaucratic. What was written existed. What was not written faded. Documentation increasingly defined reality. Language continued evolving quietly. Norman and English speech blended naturally. Class distinctions remained audible, but origin mattered less than position. Identity became functional rather than sentimental. Resistance survived only in small, discrete forms: delays, silent compliance, or muted protest. These gestures preserved personal dignity without threatening the system. They were tolerated because they were ineffective. By now, the conquest was memory rather than lived experience. Ordinary people understood their lives through routine, obligation, and endurance, not dramatic history. The system had settled into permanence. England continued quietly, predictably, and steadily, under rules that no one remembered choosing. We will conclude, softly, in the next part. And so, after decades of quiet transformation, England under Norman rule had become a land defined more by systems than by individual rulers. Authority no longer needed to display force or announce itself. It existed in the rhythms of labor, payment, obligation, and ritual. People no longer questioned the rules, they followed them because it was easier than imagining alternatives. Habit had become law. Routine had become power. Daily life was narrow, predictable, and exhausting. Fields demanded work from dawn until dusk. Livestock required care. Tools needed maintenance. Weather dictated success more than kings. Hardship was expected. Survival depended on endurance and repetition. Comfort was secondary, and ambition was rare. What mattered was knowing the next task and completing it. Local officials quietly enforced this order. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and clerks collected dues, recorded disputes, and maintained records. Their presence was familiar, largely unremarkable, yet unavoidable. Compliance became instinctive. Obedience required less effort than resistance. Energy was better spent on survival than questioning authority. Taxes and rents structured life. Obligations arrived predictably, shaping calendars and work cycles. People planned their lives around these duties rather than whims or desires. The system ensured priorities were clear, leaving little room for deviation. Predictability had become the quiet scaffolding of daily existence. Homes remained simple, functional, and minimally comfortable. Repairs were routine, expansion was rare, privacy was limited, adaptation shaped expectations. Life was measured by survival rather than comfort or aspiration. Health remained unreliable. Disease, injury, and death appeared without warning. Communities relied on tradition, prayer, and mutual support. The system noted population changes, but offered no intervention. Suffering was a quiet, persistent companion. Religion structured time, reinforced morality, and anchored the community. Church rituals guided daily life. Faith explained hardship and normalized obedience. Virtue was equated with compliance. Knowledge of the system was more valuable than knowledge of the world. Education remained narrow and functional. Literacy existed primarily for administrative or religious purposes. Knowledge flowed downward carefully. Curiosity survived quietly, constrained by necessity. Learning was a tool for service, not exploration. Trade expanded slowly under supervision. Towns grew cautiously. Markets became more structured. Opportunity existed, but always within limits. Prosperity came with obligations and oversight. Regulation framed progress. Social hierarchy remained firm. Birth determined most outcomes. Rare exceptions were absorbed without disrupting the system. Stability was valued above ambition. The ruling elite maintained balance among themselves. Alliances shifted. Disputes arose. Authority required constant attention even at the top. Stability below did not eliminate tension above. Governance persisted through vigilance, negotiation, and careful maintenance rather than dramatic displays of power. Castles blended into the landscape. Their stone walls symbolized permanence and quiet authority. They reassured rather than intimidated. Records multiplied. England's memory grew heavier in parchment and ink. What was written existed. What was not written faded. Documentation increasingly defined reality. Language continued evolving. Norman and English speech blended naturally. Class distinctions were audible, but origin mattered less than position. Identity became practical rather than sentimental. Resistance survived only in subtle gestures, delays, muted compliance, or silence. These preserved dignity without challenging the system. The administration tolerated them because they were ineffective. By the end of William's transformation, England had become a land defined by habit, structure, and routine. Conquest had receded into memory. Daily life was dictated by systems rather than individuals. Authority was quiet, persistent, and enduring. History had done its work. England operated smoothly, predictably, and quietly, under rules no one remembered choosing. And so, you may finally rest, knowing that centuries of order can be quiet, relentless, and soporific. The Norman conquest is over. England endures. And you may drift off.